This video is to demonstrate how to open a client in the Therapy Notes system for the Stress and Trauma Treatment Center. Within your access of Therapy Notes, you will find there's a library. Within the library are the most up-to-date versions of all forms. When you're accessing or utilizing a form, I do encourage that you go here to be able to get that most current version. So something that's kept on your desktop, something that's printed out and carried around, that may not be the most current version. So here is where you're going to find the most current version of all forms that we utilize. When we're opening a new client to services, a couple of the forms that are really important for us to make sure we share with them is the client registration form, the consent form, the statement of privacy practices, release of information, as well as maybe consent for transportation or other types of consents that may be relevant to your particular client or consumer. First, I will share the consent to treatment and limitations. Within this form, this is the document that really provides that active consent for services. Many individuals will not want to read a lot of this information. That's okay. They don't have to read every single clause within the consent. But what we're going to do is we're going to have them fill out information about the consumer, who is the individual that's receiving services here. And then we want to talk about how they are consenting for services to begin and talk about some of the limits of confidentiality. These limits of confidentiality will have different headings, as well as some information about sharing with insurance and payer sources, sharing information, referral platforms, other provisions that might be necessary. For individuals that are 12 and older, the state of Illinois, those individuals have the ability to assent for services as well as refuse services. And so what we encourage is that anybody who's 12 and older, we need the youth signature first as a priority. And the caregiver signature is also very important. But if a caregiver is not aware of services, it is acceptable for a youth to be in services without caregiver's permission or consent. Now, for someone who is 11 and under, that's not true. That very much the caregiver signature is the priority in here. We do want to go over this so that a person is fully aware of what they're consenting to when they're consenting for services. In addition to that, we're going to give them the client registration form. In that client registration form, we're going to have them complete this information. This is where they're going to write down a lot of demographic information, answer questions about their insurance and who's responsible for the services, or who's responsible for paying for the services. And they're going to sign a statement that basically says that we're able to submit for billing or reimbursement for the services that they are receiving. So we want them to sign this document and print their name. Typically, this is going to be done by the person who is responsible for paying for services. If it's a public source like Medicaid, it is okay that it is a youth that is 12 or older. If it's a private source, it's important that the caregiver has to sign. So if it's Blue Cross Blue Shield or some other private insurance, the caregiver actually has to sign that. We cannot submit for reimbursement to private insurance providers without caregiver consent. And so make sure that we have that information here. In addition, we're going to give clients this copy of the Notice of Privacy Practices. This is a copy. You don't need a signature for this, but you want to make sure that every family is given this copy of a Notice of Privacy Practices. Releases of information. We do need release of information to communicate with any other organization or agency. We do encourage that in the services that you are providing services and you're coordinating with multiple agencies and multiple sectors that are all influencing the youth or the consumer's life. In that, a default is that for every youth that we want to have a school release of information and a primary care provider. Primary care is a very important aspect of that, and is oftentimes the leader of the healthcare or the wellness plan for a child or a family. And so we want to have both of those at minimum. But if you have other individuals, including if I have a 12 or older client and I want to be able to communicate with their caregiver, I also want that 12 and older youth to sign a release of information so that I can communicate with that caregiver, since that 12 or older youth has the ability to assent to releases of information and make decisions for their own treatment services. And so we're going to fill this out. We're going to put in the name of who is authorizing it. If it is a 12 or older person, then their name will be here. And they're authorizing for our agency to communicate with other agencies in that specific system. Or if it's under 12, then they might put the name of the client or the youth, and then how our agencies either able to communicate with other agencies that are out there or other persons. If it's an aunt or an uncle, if it's some other person that's a natural support that's part of the life of the youth, that's good too. Oftentimes we're going to check for entire medical record, but it doesn't have to be that. It could be just around mental health treatment records or services or supports, or maybe something else that has some limitations to that. All the time, it is at the request of the individual personal representative. And so that's our purpose in doing that. And then we want to get our signature or their signature for this release of information. As a note, releases of information are typically good for 12 months. And so every 12 months, you do want to renew or fill out a new one of these forms as it's necessary. You may also find that transportation consent might be part of that. And so if you think that you might be transporting a consumer or a family different places, you do want to go ahead and get that transportation consent form completed. Or maybe other things like even a photograph consent form might be something that you might need if you anticipate that that might end up happening. So as a summary, this is the opening paperwork for anyone that is accessing services, whether they're a youth, adult, or family. We do want to be able to make sure this is done as early as possible in the treatment services. We don't want to deny people services or supports, but at the same time, I don't want to have or start to provide services without active consent in the chart. And so it's not a rigid, like we will deny someone supports if they're just walking off the street or if they just need us right then, but it's also something that we need to make sure and get at the first meeting, if at all possible.